emerging threats to procurement and the supply chain. Chris Kulp is managing director and leader of the procurement and sourcing group of Alvarez and Marsal. Hi, Chris.
Good morning.
Welcome.
Nice
Thank
to
you
meet
very
you.
much for being with me. Chris, are we still seeing supply chain bottlenecks out there? And if so, where?
Absolutely. I would say that the supply chain bottlenecks we saw last year, which were first and foremost in the ocean-borne and then eventually ground-based transportation, certainly those have lightened both in terms of availability of supply as well as some of the cost challenges we had. But I would tell you that the next tier down in terms of actually looking at the tier one, tier two supply bases, the labor challenges they're having, the volatility of supply and their inability to secure the raw materials they need. Obviously, it varies by category. Are absolutely still present. And I think what we're starting to see with the recession, given all of the buildup that everyone had focused on, building capacity, trying to grow, setting out large forecasts for future demand, what we're seeing is with the drop off in demand, we're seeing a lot of companies suddenly looking at working capital, starting to see cash issues, and I think that's going to manifest itself as volatility in terms of company performance and financial stability in the coming quarter.
Still a tight labor market, though, right?
Absolutely. In fact, we're internally thinking that the reason that the core CPI data, although CPI has gone down, the non-energy, non-food piece is still relatively flat, if not moderately growing. We think a lot of that is because the stickiness of increased wage inflation is going to be very difficult to get away from. We are still seeing attrition turnover rates in double digits in industries and companies that have historically had low single digit turnover. So we actually see that as being a continuing issue for the next 12 to 18 months.
Sure, it's hard to imagine that employers having hiked up labor rates in order to attract people are going to suddenly turn around and have it be accepted that they just drop them again. It's sort of like it hits
Exactly.
that level and it stays there. What about inventory levels, availability of inventory right now? We're hearing now that before there wasn't enough, now there's too much. It's a hard seesaw to deal with. Where are we right now on that?
We're not in a good spot, to put it bluntly. I'd offer maybe a couple perspectives. If I look at some of my larger retail clients serving Target, Walmart, CVS, or even just my industrial clients, overall inventory levels are extremely high. But let me double click in that because I think there's two dimensions of that are worth capturing. So
Okay.
one is obviously when your supplier is not delivering what you want, when they're putting you on allocation, you're going to send a strong demand signal to them. In fact, you might even not to say unscrupulously, but you might even inflate your demand numbers to make sure that you're the most attractive customer for them.
Mm.
So a lot of inflation in the forecast signals that went out to the supply base. Supply base obviously tried to ramp up to the extent they could to capture all this demand. I mean, just seeing many of our customers, our portfolio companies, they had record years last year and they have, anywhere from a 6 to 22 month backlog. So, everyone's eager to kind of build capacity. So people built capacity based on, frankly, I think a relatively false view of the future. And now we've obviously seen demand drop down. So what's the implication? So, you sent false demand signals, suppliers, built capacity, your warehouses were filled. Many of our customers have done anywhere from a 15 to a 45% increase in their warehousing square footage capacity.
Wow.
So now I've got a lot of inventory. I've got a supply base that's primed to fill, a pretty large warehouse. And suddenly demand has dropped, in some industries, 10, in some industries, as many as 30, 40%. So what's the implication of that? Suddenly, I'm not ordering anymore. The orders down to the supply base have gone down precipitously. So there's a lot of confusion in the supply base now in terms of what do we do next, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is creating a lot of churn in the supply base. But we're seeing a secondary impact that's actually a little bit more concerning. So if I'm a physical goods distributor or company, I ordered, 8 months ago, the priority of my procurement organization was just get material to fill the factory. So supplier came through with a cost increase. My buyer said, that's fine, I'll take it. Just get the material here, please. They ordered the material in February, normally a 2-month lead time, now a 6-month lead time. Material shows up on the dock in August, doesn't get put into the factory to actually to be productized until September, October. So if you're the CFO, all you see is inventory levels going up. You don't really understand if is it the wrong inventory? Is it too much inventory? Is it the cost base? because of the FIFO nature of inventory, it's not until those products actually, or that inventory gets converted into a finished good, now 6 to 8 months after the cost increase was already accepted, that suddenly they're actually able to see it on the P&L in terms of a product margin.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting a tremendous amount of concerns from our CFOs around, hey, I just realized that I lost half of my product margin, and my procurement organization is telling me that that's old news, that we accepted that 8 months ago. And a lot of them are looking to January when they have to set new standards for standard costs. How do they do that, right? On the one hand, I could use the most recent costs, but given the way commodity prices are leveling, in some cases falling, how do I think about costs for next year? How do I kind of manage that? So a lot of opportunities to look at not just how do I tackle the inflation that I've absorbed, but also how do I think about setting my cost structure for next year?
Yeah. FIFO, first in, first out inventory management strategies
Absolutely.
in warehouses. All right. And then here we have the possibility, in fact, a real probability of a recession next year, if indeed we aren't already in one now. So, on top of all of this, you're talking about the present day state of affairs. How are companies buckling down and preparing for a recession?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say right now, given the drop in demand, we're seeing a tremendous amount of concerns in terms of how do we really tighten down the cost structure. Um, so look, as much as I'm a supply chain fan, the fastest levers for cost out are not always the supply chain. Typically, we're seeing companies start with looking at their own SG&A structure, looking at headcount reductions, looking at RIFs, in some cases, looking at shifting some of their fixed costs to variable. We're partnering with our SG&A kind of workforce management. We're doing a lot of work there in terms of looking at how do we optimize operations for potentially a significantly reduced demand and operation profile next year.
Mm-hmm.
The next lever we're looking at is kind of margin management. Although there's been a lot of price increases passed to customers in the last year or two, I think there's a newer look at that now in terms of, given where we see the business going forward. I can certainly cut some of my costs, some I can't. Am I really truly passing on the right cost structure to my customers to make sure that I'm absorbing that in my margin?
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, obviously, supply chain is clearly, for many of our customers, COGS represents 60 to 80% of the revenue base of the cost of the overall business structure. We're seeing a lot of requests to kind of now go back out and really challenge the inflation that's been passed along. I would tell you, when we dig into some of the inflation costs that have been passed from the supply base, what we're finding is 30% of the time it's rational, it's justified, it's understandable. Probably 50% of the time it made sense 6 months ago but since then commodities have peaked and come down. How do we begin to look at clawing some of that back, recapturing some of that? But I would tell you 20 to 30% of the time we're finding that it's profiteering on the part of the supply base, right? And we're seeing companies get much more willing to go aggressively after that, in some cases looking for retroactive clawbacks and other opportunities. And all of this is manifesting itself as a very different contractual relationship going forward, trying to anticipate how do we handle this much more dynamically going forward instead of taking these static one-time costs.
So is that shifting balance of power between supplier and buyer? And it seems like it's going back to the supplier at the moment. Funny you should say that the emphasis is so strongly now on cost, because conventional wisdom that we've been hearing recently is, well, supply chains used to be oriented completely on cost, and now they're taking a whole new, broader view of things in terms of supplier diversification, ESG, environmental, social, and governance. They're willing to pay more in order to do this, and yet we're back to cost again. It seems like we always come back to that, do we not, at some point?
We do, and I think what's been instructive for a lot of our clients is that in the same way there's a lead time for ordering goods and supplies, there's a lead time in terms of seeing how the cost increases when we realize them at the point of I'll call it the point of supplier engagement, to the time that they actually hit the P&L with lead times extending the way they are. I think there's a huge lag effect, and I think people are now just beginning to realize just how badly the margins are going to hit from a lot of the cost increases that were taken 6, 8, in some cases even 12 months ago.
Mm-hmm. So companies are going to be preparing for some rough waters in the months to come. Thank you very much, Chris. I wish we could continue this conversation. Indeed, I hope we can at a later date. But for now, thank you so much for being with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Robert.